Reflection with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And therefore, our secret here is to break that down into more manageable goals. So someone says, by the end of this week, I'm going to be walking at least 5 blocks.
Today on Reflection, Father Bacik talks with Dr. Thomas Dunn, professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. Father Bacik and Dr. Dunn will discuss self-management, perspective, and technique. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Tom, I really enjoy talking about psychological matters with you. I don't know if it's because of your background, that you are a behaviorist type psychologist, kind of people I ordinarily don't get along with. And I find it fascinating to meet a behaviorist I can talk to. Maybe that's part of it. Or maybe it's because we both love baseball, and you have memories of the old Brooklyn Dodgers built into your psyche somehow. But whatever it is, I feel a certain kinship and find it interesting to speak with you. And I want to talk a little bit today about the whole idea of self-management. And I know when I start talking about that, I approach it very often in terms of awareness. That is, that to me, if we're going to make progress in life, we have to understand some things about ourselves. We have to know ourselves in greater depth, because that's nothing new. That goes back to the Greek philosophers who said the first rule was, know thyself. The only way to make progress in life is to be aware of one's strengths and limitations, be able to capitalize on one and sort of overcome the other. Anyway, I'm interested in talking about this self-management thing, and I guess my contribution is more in the theoretical realm or the religious self-awareness side, and I'm sort of hoping from you to hear some techniques and some skills in how we might manage our lives better as adults.
Okay, in doing so, I'm sure that what will come up is actually pointing to two different issues. One is self-awareness and learning more about yourself. And the second part, or the other issue, is then what do you do about it once you learn about it?
Right.
That's where a behavioral point of view would come in, I'm sure.
Yeah, that. Right, yeah. Then that's what I always think that the strength of you behaviorists is. In the sense that,
I like the way you say that.
Yes, right. That you have found out some techniques and ways to help people change their behavior when they find out that there's something that isn't really working well. I mean, I'm thinking of something that I deal with people a lot of times, and that is a poor self-image. And, they'll do things like say, well, I always mess up. If they mess up one thing throughout the day, their conclusion is, well, I always mess up. I'm the kind of person that can't be trusted, or I'm not responsible. And really, there's a logical fallacy in that. That is that one misdeed doesn't make one a bad person.
Right.
And yet they make that assumption. And so, therefore, I'm sitting there dealing with someone now who thinks they are a bad person, who has a very poor self-image, low self-esteem, and now I'm trying to figure out, well, how am I going to help that person, to manage their lives better? How am I going to help that person to do a better job of living effectively and to feel better about themselves? So maybe that's a way of getting at it. Now, I mean, from my viewpoint, I can put that in a theological framework right away, and what I like to tell people is, well, you're important, You are an individual. God loves you as you are. There's a God who cares for you and wants you to become your better self. There's models that we have in the Christian religion here, the Jesus Christ, and that's why we talk about the saints and so on, people who have shown us how to live more effectively. So I want to try to tell them right away there's a theological framework for this. Now, I want the church to be part of this. I want to say, well, the church is a community of people, get involved in your parish, and there I hope you meet people with similar value systems, and there's people there who naturally will support you because they're trying to live out the law of love and charity towards one another. So you see, I can bring to bear on this situation a whole lot of important and what I think are correct theological insights, and I believe they will help them. But I'm also well aware that more is needed than that,
right,
if they're really going to make progress.
Well, as you stated it in the last few minutes, the field of psychology, and in this case self-management we're talking about, very consistent with the theological point of view that you were stating. as a psychologist, we would be more precise about pointing people into directions and certain behaviors. But there is one interesting principle that we would be encouraging someone who came with that, how you were describing an individual who's down on himself or down on herself, and that is to practice the incompatible. And
explain to me what that means.
Okay. Well, if you feel, if you're down and depressed, and if you keep on telling yourself depressing thoughts, that we would encourage them to practice what's incompatible with that. Well, what's incompatible with depressing thoughts is positive thoughts. That you actually think positive things of yourself. For someone who's very inactive, someone who's very depressed, they tend to be very inactive also. We would then encourage them to be active. So it's really quite similar to what you were saying. You're saying if you're depressed and lonely, then well, come join a community. And some people, we would be very consistent in that regard.
Yeah, you would reinforce bad behavior for sure. Yeah.
We would point people and encouraging them to do that, and we would also hope to establish situations so that behavior would be reinforced. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So that, because that's
from our viewpoint, it would be really vital that the community is indeed supportive that they ended up in.
But we couldn't guarantee that right away, could we?
No, we cannot, except that, would become one of the functions of our parishes, we would hope, that because people there espouse Christian principles, that therefore they're going to try to be loving and supportive and properly challenging to the other people in the community. But you're right, you can't count on that.
Well, and because we can't count on it, we would then ask the individual to compliment himself or herself for trying.
Yeah.
Or at least provide some kind of reinforcement, because the natural reinforcement either may come down the road or it may not come right away, and we can't control that community.
Yeah.
But just even for trying, we want the person for that effort, that effort to be viewed as positive, so that they actually tried to do something and found it, at least. And pat yourself on the back is what we say.
Yeah. Even for the effort, even if it didn't work out exactly right.
That's right.
Okay, Tom, let's talk a little bit more here about the kinds of problems that we find in self-management. I mean, where do people usually get off of the track in managing themselves? One of the things I'm always talking to groups about is the management of time, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time on that, but that really is one of the areas where people do not manage their time well. They don't budget it properly. They don't do the most difficult tasks and important tasks at the right time of the day. There's all kinds of problems along that line that I'm very well aware of, and we could probably expand on. I'm looking for maybe some other ways in which we don't manage
certainly
well.
The whole class of behaviors that both of us at the University of Toledo, we know students in study skills, and that's a classic example. And then there's...
okay, let's say more about that. I mean, where do people usually go wrong in their study skills?
Well, you put your finger on it. To a considerable extent, it's time management. But the interesting thing is, with regard to self-management, it's much better for people to focus on a particular problem rather than saying, I just don't manage my time well.
Yeah, okay.
Because that's so broad.
Right.
So if it's something about not studying well or not setting aside of time and place to study, then deal with that. And in fact, I did say something. That's very interesting. It turns out that a good self-management skill for studying is set aside a time and place to study.
One of the most important things you can do.
Exactly.
That would be like a definite time each day, a time when you know you do well and are primed for it, and you won't sit around and daydream as much, and so on.
I always find examples in my own life, and I remember when I first started jogging, I would say, well, how much jogging am I going to do this week? Well, I'm kind of busy. If I have time on Tuesday, I'll do that. And maybe if I have time on Friday, I'll do that. And, of course, I never jogged.
Right.
And what really helped me was, no matter what, I will jog on Tuesday. I will jog on Thursday at so-and-so time.
Right.
Well, I did it. And so in terms of study behavior, if the student then says, I will study so many hours on Tuesday, and a place, too, then it has a way of drawing you to it. Is there a guarantee? No, it's no guarantee. It increases the likelihood.
Right.
A time and a place for everything is really what that principle is.
And again, there has to be intelligence in picking those out, doesn't it? I mean, there's no sense in saying I'm going to jog on Friday if Friday's just impossible to jog. I mean, it's your schedule. So you've got to use
some idea of what you're doing.
And I was thinking the same way with place, though, with studying. I mean, students may say, well, I'm going to study in front of the TV set in my living room at home. And then that's probably not a good place to study because there's all kind of distractions. Or people trying to study in their room in the residence hall where maybe they have noisy roommates or something. So that you do really have to figure out, use your brains in a sense, what is going to be best along that line.
A place that's conducive to study.
Right.
So that when you're in that place, it just becomes fairly natural for you to study.
It's interesting. I often advise people to have a certain place to pray or meditate.
Same principle.
Yeah, I think even if in a room, that if you have a meditating chair, for example, maybe there's a chair where you'd usually do your study or your work or your whatever else, but then when it's time to meditate, you move to another chair, and it's like, in my mind, it almost...
You're a psychologist.
But don't tell me I'm a behaviorist. But you move into another chair, and it's almost like you're already prayerful, like you're setting the stage for it. It's almost auto-suggestive.
Well, in the psych language, that's called the chair of discriminative stimulus. Sounds heavy, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What it means is that over time, that particular part of the environment almost cues you to respond in a certain way, and because you've done it several times. And see, that's part of good self-management. And so that we can do that in so many different areas of our lives. We already do it, and we didn't think about it. In other words, some people already do it, and they're used to doing certain things at a certain time, so that, well, they do it.
That takes me back to that whole self-awareness thing that I'm always pressing, and that it gives me a slightly different slant on it, and that is that we ought to be very aware in our lives of what works for us. Mm-hmm. And become aware of the dynamics of why it works, because then that enables us to repeat it. In fact, I find myself in counseling doing that a lot of times. If somebody makes progress, I'm not one way is to say, well, good, I'm glad, now let's go on to another problem. But I usually like to say, let's figure out why it worked.
Right.
Because, and my statement is usually because you might be back in that situation again sometime, and you got to know how to get out of it. So if someone's depressed and then they find out that they exercise regularly and they go over and visit their friends and they somehow are lifted out of it, say, get it down, write it. Let's not lose that, because the next time you're depressed, you want to make sure to go back and use those coping skills in that new situation.
Exactly, and that's where the self-management comes in. See, if success is achieved once, go over it, review it. What did you do that was successful there? What did you do that was unsuccessful? How could you change it to make it more likely to occur? And that whole process increases the likelihood that in that situation again, the person will be a little more self-managed.
That's right. And that goes back to the thing you said before about you like to deal with concrete cases. You don't just want to say, in general, I want to become a better person, or in general, I want to be more virtuous or use my time better. But what I want to do is figure out some particular thing that I want to accomplish, and some particular task I have in my life, and analyze that more carefully and in detail and find out what the dynamics are. So someone could say, well, I did well in last quarter in my studies, but I'm not doing well this quarter. So one thing you'd want to maybe figure out is why. Maybe you don't like the professor.
And what do you mean by doing better?
Yeah.
Also.
Even a deeper question, yeah.
That's right. I mean, very simple. Grades. How well did you do? Or not just grades, but how much time. Is there a difference in how much time you spent? Now you spent studying, and viewing that as success in itself. Even if there's only a slight increase in grade, again, that's where there's, that's one of the most difficult things of working with students, if they do study and put some more time in it and do everything you say, and if their grades don't go up right away, it can be very discouraging. So
you want to play out, maybe the courses are harder, maybe you're taking more hours.
Right, and you focus on other things too, like, well, listen, you're studying better, and that's good. And so feel good about that. Pat yourself on the back for that. And so you can keep going.
Okay, well, let's look at what else here about self-management do we want to keep in mind, other areas that seem important.
Well, for around the house, for anybody who has to take care of things around the house, there's a whole host of things. I mean, just keeping the house clean, getting things done, getting the cleaning done, Some people need to be better self-managed about that.
I run into people who say they just can't do that, or, I'm not into that, or I haven't really ever learned in my life how to do that.
And, of course, if they choose not to and they can live with it, then it's okay. But a lot of people don't like that about themselves.
Right. Okay, so how are we going to help someone change now? Let's take a concrete example.
I'll be very concrete about it. If we were doing that, what I would encourage the individual to do, and this is when I teach at the university, I teach a course on self-management, and I have people get what I call baseline data. And that is, all right, don't worry about changing yourself for a week. Just go out and observe yourself. What do you do? How often, in this case, cleaning up the house, what do you do with things when you take them out? Do you put them away? Do you just throw them on the floor? Do you clean up? How often do you do the dishes? Or how long do the dishes stay there? In other words, you become a good observer of yourself.
Yes.
That process can be a painful one for some people, especially if what they're dealing with is a very serious issue. But it's usually always worthwhile.
And they're going to learn something. They're going to see
self-awareness.
They're going to see a pattern.
Precisely. That's what you want them to see is a pattern. And so what may have started as kind of, I don't think I'm doing a good enough job, and be very precise, and get down to the fact is, look, when I take things out, clothes out of a closet, I never put them back.
Right. So therefore, there are clothes laying all around my apartment, and therefore I'm afraid to have guests over or something. And
therefore I hate myself.
Yeah, and therefore I'm a bad person. Right. So now we're going to say, what's our next step? So we've gotten awareness of this now.
Well, with awareness, then establish some goals.
Okay.
And what may have started as a fuzzy goal, we can get very precise about it.
Okay, let's take our example of leaving clothes laying around and so on.
Well, one of them would be that for every piece of clothing I take out, I put it back in with that day. It's pretty precise. Now, there could be other goals related to cleaning up the house or you name it. One of the things to keep in mind about goal setting, one of the very important principles of self-management is that you separate what may be viewed as a long-term goal, and for some people they feel it's a mountain. I'll never be able to do that. It's a mountain to climb. Right. Separate that long-term goal from a more short-term goal.
That is possible to achieve.
Yes. And so a good principle of self-management is that you set goals, and you set short-term goals that you can accomplish within maybe today, maybe tomorrow.
So you don't start out by saying, I'm going to have the most immaculate apartment in the whole city of Toledo tomorrow.
Or else I'm not going to do anything about it. Right.
Yeah. Because that's always paralyzing, isn't it? I mean, when the goals are too high, then we say, why bother? So if someone says, I'm going to run in a marathon, and they haven't run for years, I mean, that becomes sort of silly. So they say, well, I'll never make it, so I'm not going to do it.
Or the overweight person who cannot look perfect tomorrow doesn't do anything today.
That's right. And it's a terrible trap, isn't it? And it just really occurs in so many ways in life. And therefore, our secret here is to break that down into more manageable goals. So someone says, by the end of this week, I'm going to be walking at least 5 blocks.
Yes, right.
And then
a little bit above where you are.
Right.
And see, now, in order to be able to state those good short-term goals, it really helps for you to have done the self-observation first. Because those small goals will be will demand a little bit more than what you're doing now. If you don't know what you're doing now, then you couldn't have set the goal.
So I sit down and say, how much exercise do I do in a week?
Yes.
Right, and I walk 4 blocks a day on an average. Therefore, I'm going to set as a goal now, I'm going to walk 6 blocks a day.
And maybe for just 2 days you do that.
Right.
And then maybe after another couple of days you go on to 8 blocks or whatever it is. And the interesting thing about setting these short goals, something very interesting happens to people. People who really are self-critical and engage in that process we talked about before, not liking themselves, wanting themselves to be at a certain point, will often not allow themselves to attain less than perfection on the first time out. So having that short-term goal should be reinforcing to that individual.
Yeah.
And if
something good should happen because I walked 6 blocks today.
And if it isn't, then I encourage people to reinforce themselves.
Right.
See, pat yourself on the back, we call it, but literally, if you want to allow yourself to go out and buy some short little small thing for yourself, go out and do it.
Right.
But the small goals are very important, and they're benchmarks, and they could be reinforcing in themselves. And again, we talked about...
Yeah, when you say reinforcing in themselves, one of the things that the person might just say, well, I feel pretty good about this. I walked 6 blocks today, or I got my clothes put away today.
That's right. And if the person had not even bothered to attempt that, they would not have had that opportunity. And see, that's the interesting thing. Because if they're always focused on being at the top of the mountain,
right,
and that may not happen for a couple of years or whatever, then if they hadn't, having a short-term goal allows them to provide some reinforcement, self-reinforcement, feeling good about it, and increases the likelihood they'll try again.
Right. I could probably put that in some sort of theological framework, too, and talk about every bit of effort that we expend like that is of value, that every small decision we make to try to do something good in our lives is collected. It becomes part of our character, part of our personality. It was sort of, the principle I often enunciate is we're making ourselves to be what we will be forever. And that to each one of those little steps, it's really crucially important. Well, I think it depends on how long you mean the forever, Tom. If you move that beyond death, then you are definitely in the world of theology. So, anyway, I would say there's a reinforcement in that. There's a sense that all these little decisions I'm making are crucially important because they're part of what I am forever. I'm making myself to be what I am as I stand before my God.
And so every day has meaning.
Yeah. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, now what else are we going to do here to try to... I know one of the things I was thinking is the great importance of writing things down. Sometimes I was thinking when we went through this process, if we wrote down the thing that we're not doing well, I procrastinate always on doing my writing in the morning, and therefore I note this, and therefore I have to figure out how I'm going to get started right away. I got to make sure I don't spend a lot of time rearranging my desk and...
Well, you bring up a classic example of self-management, and this happens so often in my teaching. And when I teach this course, people have to choose something and to work with. And predictably, at least 15 to 20% of the students deal with being on time for work or school.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that they have to do, what you were saying is self-observation. The importance of that is, what do they do when they get up in the morning? What do they spend their time doing?
Yeah.
Well, it's an understatement to say how enlightening that process can be. And very often people then have to begin the observation the night before because it may be that they're not getting enough sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But typically people don't get up when the alarm rings.
Right.
Well, obviously that's something that they can work on. You see, that whole bit about self-observation, you learn so much, but it also helps you key in on what to work with.
Right. So if they say, I want to be on time at school, but I'm always late, and then they observe and they say, well, what happens, the alarm clock rings at 7:30, but I don't get out of bed till 8:15. I mean, we've got an obvious solution here. So what do we do at that point? How do we get them to get up at 7:30 when the alarm clock rings?
Well, what we could say is, well, don't worry about it and get to work at 8:15 anyway, but if they can't...
No.
Well, basically, the part of the process of self-management is the goal setting. And if the person doesn't think that they can get up right away at 7:30, then we can sort of do it gradually. And providing some reinforcement for attaining the goal. If you look at it from another perspective, there's some reason why the person's not getting up.
Right.
And usually it's because it's more reinforcing to stay in bed.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's 0 degrees out and the wind's whistling and you're very comfortable under the covers, it's more reinforcing for you to stay in bed. So what we try to do is balance that and say, well, how could getting up and getting dressed now be a little bit more reinforcing?
Right.
So in the beginning, literally, we have them choose artificial reinforcement, maybe, that they earn some points that they can turn it into something at a later date. A lot of people don't like that aspect of self-management because it sounds, well, for one, it
sounds gamey and
very behavioral.
Right.
But it's an artificial way of tuning the person in, so to speak.
Yeah.
And very often...
I think that's valuable. I find myself suggesting that sort of thing to people at times. I keep a chart for the week, and I want to know exactly how many times you get up at 7:30, and then you're going to come in here a week from now, and if you got up every day at 7:30, then we're going to sit here and say, that's terrific. You know, look at you are. You think you're an undisciplined person, and for a whole week you got up at 7:30. It's not true you're undisciplined.
That's right. Right. And in fact, the word undisciplined, I would discourage the person from using that term altogether because,
Right.
well, what do you mean by that?
Right.
And you say, well, how would I know you're undisciplined? The person tells me an example of behavior. Then I know how to switch that into what we called, come back before, an incompatible response.
Yeah.
See, if this is what you mean by being irresponsible or whatever, what do you mean by being responsible? The incompatible response.
Right.
And then that's what you set as a goal, and that's what you reinforce.
Right. So, and one of the things you try to get people to do is to reinforce themselves. In other words, they have to feel good about themselves because they're able to get up at 7:30, or because they got their clothes put away, or began to do their diet like you wanted them to.
Exactly. And in fact, I'm sure in your work you have worked so often with individuals who are depressed. And one of the things we find in the literature and also in work is that people who are depressed have never reinforced themselves. They don't think
they're
they
just
deserve
out
it.
of the habit.
Exactly. They don't think they deserve it. They don't do anything that deserves a compliment. And so they literally need to practice self-reinforcement. And so you structure situations so the person even practices saying good things to themselves.
Right.
Just to try it on, and sometimes they can't say it. I mean, they literally can't say it.
Yeah, even if you feed back an honest compliment to them, very often they're not able to handle it. They screen it out. You almost have this physical feeling like they won't let it in.
Exactly.
There's some sort of grid
That's right.
that keeps it from coming
Whether
in.
they think they're unworthy, or it's just so, oh, that's not me, I can't deal with that, I'm no good, or that's true.
Tom, it strikes me that there's an awful lot of good advice that you have given here in this program about how we're going to manage ourselves and try to improve our behavior. I guess, I start out with that whole notion that awareness is important, and you come at it from this observation technique. I think what you've done is refine that thing that I usually talk about. That is, you said write it down, look very carefully at how you use your time and how you go about this whole task. And I think that then you have some good suggestions about how to go about that. And I think the key sounds to me, it's reinforcement, to be able to say, yes, this behavior works well for me.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Dr. Thomas Dunn, professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was self-management, perspective, and technique. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.